In this tutorial, we're going to concentrate on the Black Power movement, which was this kind of opposite group or idea, opposite to peaceful protest, and particularly it was at polar opposites to the ideas of Martin Luther King. Its origins and its background, it actually goes back to a group called the Nation of Islam. That's where this whole idea really originates from, and the Nation of Islam was a Muslim group determined to, one of their big ideas was to create this separate state for black people. That was one of their big ideas, a separate state for black people within the USA. So it's very different to Martin Luther King, who wanted to bring white and black together into one country to live in harmony. And one of the people in the Nation of Islam who joined the Nation of Islam and became, if you like, one of their chief spokespeople was Malcolm X, previously known as Malcolm Little, because in fact members of this group, the Nation of Islam, actually changed their names. They changed their names and they omitted their slave names, so the names that were given to them by their white slave owners. So in this case, the name Little was a name that was given to Malcolm X, or passed down to Malcolm X anyway, essentially from white people. So Malcolm rejects that, and he changes his name to Mr. X, as he likes to be called, and famously he was called Mr. X in a BBC television interview. He asked to be called, he said he was comfortable being called Mr. X. So it sounds strange, but actually it makes sense when you think about the fact that name Little was associated with so much pain and suffering for him and other members of the group. Later, Malcolm X would visit Mecca. He visited Mecca, and actually when he returned, he rejected the ideas of the Nation of Islam. He went for a less religious approach, and actually in the end that's what cost him his life, because he was actually assassinated by 3 black people. He was killed by 3 black people, people with the same colour of skin that he had. But he was incredibly influential. The Nation of Islam, the membership grew by 100,000, grew up to 100,000 people by 1962, and a lot of that was down to the work of Malcolm X, his speeches, his organisation. He connected really well particularly with urban youth, really disaffected youth from inner cities, because that's where he was from. And he spent some time in jail, in fact, for crimes that he committed in the 1940s. So he could really relate to a lot of the kind of down and outs, perhaps in some ways, perhaps more than Martin Luther King. Coming out of those ideas of Malcolm X came this Black Power movement. The person who first came up with this it was a political slogan. Black Power was a slogan, and the person who came up with this slogan and the person who became very much associated with the Black Power movement was a gentleman called Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael was a real kind of radical young black youth. Originally, he'd been involved with lots of peaceful protests. For example, he took part in the Freedom Rides. He spent 7 weeks in jail as a result of that activity. He was very much involved with the student protest movement from black people. And actually, Martin Luther King was one of the people who really admired Stokely Carmichael. What Martin Luther King didn't necessarily like was this political slogan, Black Power, implying that blacks would intimidate whites, would separate themselves from whites. But that's really the approach that Stokely Carmichael took with the Black Power movement. And probably the most famous incident involving members of the Black Power movement was in 1968 at the Olympics. at the Olympics when two black people, one called John Carlos and the other one called Tommy Smith, when their race had finished, they performed the Black Power salute. Now, you've got to remember the Olympic Games is supposed to be a non-political event. And actually, one of the Australian, there was a top three on the podium, Carlos Smith and also an Australian called Peter Norman. Peter Norman also wore a badge with a human rights, the Olympic Committee human rights emblem on it in support of these black people. What the blacks did is they raised their fists, which was the typical Black Power salute. And from that point onwards, everyone knew about this movement. The strange thing is that actually in 1964-65, we've got the Civil Rights Bill, we've got the Voting Rights Act. There does seem to be some progress being made, but for those people living in cities, that's really where this Black Power movement comes from, because they are living in desperation, in poverty, in squalor, mass unemployment among black people. So that's really where this movement comes from. There was actually on a national level some progress actually being made. And actually coming out of this movement, we have in 1966 the establishment of the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers, who were actually a political party. By 1968, they actually had 5,000 members. They were growing in size. But the Black Panthers were a military socialist organisation. They wanted to make America socialist/communist even. They believed in this idea of socialism. So it was a class thing as well as a race thing. It was class and race. In fact, Huey Newton, who was the guy who actually set this group up, Huey Newton, actually went as far as to say it was a class thing, not a race thing. It was just a class thing. But essentially, the Black Powers were a violent group. They were trained, they had weapons, they were trying to drill up political support, and actually the FBI were very concerned that the Black Panthers might actually try to mount some kind of revolution, a black takeover of power in America, killing the white kind of elite and replacing them with black. So they were closely monitored by the FBI, and for that reason, by 1982, the party disbanded, and that was the end of the Black Panthers. But this whole thing that you can see in front of you, originating from Malcolm X and moving on to Stokely Carmichael and Huey Newton, it really did have an impact. It scared white people. It wasn't just about the kind of Martin Luther King figure who wanted to work with them. There was this other side that was saying, we're strong enough to fight you, and we will if we have to. Malcolm X's phrase really sums up the whole thing. We will fight you, and we will use any means, by any means necessary. By any means necessary was his catchphrase. So it was about intimidating the whites, and these two, parallel views of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, actually they kind of align together, and they both had an impact in their own ways. So vitally important. And actually, from the 1970s onwards, we saw a vast improvement in the lives of black Americans, and perhaps the need for the Black Power movement did actually kind of go away.